The building that should not exist. There is a building in the center of the city that should not exist anymore. Most people pass by it without noticing anything unusual. The traffic moves normally. Store signs flicker in the windows across the street. Office workers enter the lobby each morning as if this place has always been part of the skyline. To everyone else, it's just another aging building surrounded by newer glass towers. But according to official records, that building collapsed 6 years ago. Not partially, not structurally damaged, collapsed. The incident was widely reported at the time. News channels aired footage of the scene for days. A structural failure, they said. Engineers later blamed a hidden flaw in the building's load-bearing supports. The upper floors gave way first, then the rest of the structure followed in seconds. Witnesses described a sound like thunder tearing through the street. Dust filled the air. Concrete slabs crashed into the pavement. Emergency vehicles flooded the area within minutes. 32 people were injured. 3 people died. The footage still exists in archived news segments. If you search carefully enough, you can still find photographs of the rubble, twisted metal beams, shattered glass, entire floors flattened into layers of debris. For months afterward, the location remained sealed behind temporary fencing while investigators examined the wreckage. Eventually, the remains were cleared away. The site was officially marked as a demolition zone, and that should have been the end of the story, except it wasn't, because today the building is still there, standing exactly where it always stood, not rebuilt, not redesigned. The same faded exterior, the same narrow windows, even the same rust-colored stain that runs down the west side of the facade. Nothing about it suggests reconstruction. There are no signs of modern materials, no visible repairs, no evidence that the building was ever reduced to rubble. If you didn't know the history, you would assume it had simply been there for decades, which is exactly what most people believe. Ask anyone nearby, and they'll tell you the building has never collapsed. Some will even laugh at the suggestion. The city's public records now list the structure as continuously occupied for over 40 years. No disaster report, no reconstruction permit, no mention of the collapse at all. It's as if the event was quietly erased from the timeline. Except for one problem. I remember it happening. Not vaguely, not like a distant rumor or a story someone once told me. I remember the day clearly. The sirens, the dust clouds spreading across the street, the news helicopters circling overhead. I remember standing several blocks away, watching the skyline where the building used to be, and realizing there was suddenly an empty space where it had stood only minutes before. That memory never faded. Which is why the first time I walked past that street again and looked up, I stopped. Because the building was there, standing perfectly intact, exactly where the rubble had been. Inside a structure that already fell. For several days after rediscovering the building, I avoided going near it. Not because I was afraid of it collapsing again. At least that's what I told myself. The engineers had blamed the original disaster on a structural flaw, but the building in front of me now looked perfectly stable. People entered and exited every day without hesitation. Delivery trucks stopped outside. Office lights turned on each evening. To everyone else, the building functioned like any other. But to me, it felt like walking past a ghost. Something about it refused to fit into the world the way everything else did. I tried convincing myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the collapse had happened to a different building with a similar design. Maybe the footage I remembered had been misidentified in the reports. Maybe the city had reconstructed the structure so precisely that no one could tell the difference. But the more I looked at it, the less convincing those explanations became. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. Every imperfection I remembered was still there. The faint discoloration near the third-floor windows, the crooked sign above the entrance that leaned slightly to one side, even the narrow scratch across the metal door frame that had probably been there for decades. A reconstruction wouldn't preserve those details. At some point, curiosity became stronger than hesitation. And one evening, just before sunset, I decided to go inside. The glass doors opened with a quiet mechanical hum as I stepped into the lobby. The air inside felt cooler than outside, carrying the faint, sterile smell of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale white glow across the floor tiles. Nothing about the lobby looked unusual. A receptionist's desk stood near the entrance, though no one was sitting behind it. A row of mailboxes lined the wall beside the elevators. The floor directory listed several small offices, a consulting firm, a tax preparation service, a legal assistance office, and 2 companies I didn't recognize. If this building had collapsed in the past, there was no visible evidence here. No repair seams, no fresh paint covering structural damage, no signs of reconstruction. Everything looked old in the ordinary way buildings become old. Gradual wear accumulated over time. The elevators were still operational. When I pressed the call button, the light above it flickered once before illuminating. The elevator arrived after a few seconds with a soft metallic chime. Inside, the walls were lined with brushed steel panels scratched by years of use. The floor tiles were worn near the corners where countless shoes had pivoted during stops. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. For a moment, as the doors slid shut, I felt something close to unease. Not fear exactly, more like the subtle discomfort of stepping into a place that shouldn't logically exist. The elevator moved upward with a slow mechanical vibration. 2nd floor, then 3rd. The doors opened. The hallway beyond was quiet. A long corridor stretched in both directions, illuminated by the same dim fluorescent lights that filled the lobby. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I stepped out. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. Office doors lined the hallway at regular intervals. Most were closed, though a thin strip of light glowed beneath 1 or 2 of them, suggesting someone was still working inside. But as I walked farther down the corridor, I noticed something that made me slow down. A crack. It ran along the wall about shoulder height, thin enough that I might have ignored it if the hallway lighting hadn't cast a faint shadow inside it. Hairline fractures in old buildings aren't unusual. Materials expand and contract over decades. Plaster settles, paint dries and splits. But this crack didn't look like ordinary wear. It stretched farther than I expected. Beginning near the ceiling corner and extending across several meters of wall before fading into the paint. I leaned closer. The edges of the crack were clean, as if the wall had been pulled apart rather than chipped. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing, just another aging structure developing cosmetic flaws. But then I saw another one. This one ran across the ceiling, branching outward like a thin lightning strike trapped in plaster. And then another near the corner where the hallway turned. None of them were large. None of them looked immediately dangerous. But together they formed a pattern that made something in my memory stir. I had seen fractures like this before, not in everyday buildings, in disaster footage, the kind structural engineers analyze when reviewing collapse failures, stress fractures, the early signs that something inside the structure is no longer holding weight the way it should. I stood there for several seconds, studying the lines. If this building had collapsed once before, if the event I remembered had truly happened, then these cracks might not just be cosmetic damage. They might be echoes, residual weaknesses carried over from a timeline where the structure had already failed. The thought sounded absurd even as it formed in my mind. Buildings don't remember alternate histories. Concrete doesn't hold memory. Reality doesn't split into versions where one outcome survives while another lingers beneath it. And yet I was standing inside a building that should not exist, looking at fractures that suggested it had once been under enormous structural stress. I continued walking slowly down the hallway. Each section of wall seemed to contain another faint imperfection. Some cracks were barely visible, hidden beneath layers of paint. Others stretched along the ceiling corners like spiderweb threads. None of them were dramatic, but there were too many. Far more than a building of this size should normally develop. At the end of the corridor, I found the stairwell door. The metal handle felt cold when I pushed it open. Inside, the stairwell lights flickered as if reacting to motion. Concrete steps spiraled upward and downward between the floors, and that was where the most disturbing crack appeared. It ran vertically along the corner where 2 concrete walls met. Unlike the others, this fracture wasn't subtle. It stretched from the base of the stairwell all the way to the ceiling above the landing. A thin but unmistakable split in the structure itself. Not plaster, not paint, concrete. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge. The surface felt rough, as though the material had been forced apart under pressure. If this crack widened any further, it could become a serious structural risk. And yet no warning signs had been posted. No repair crews were present. No one inside the building seemed concerned, which raised a question that slowly settled into my thoughts as I stood in that stairwell. What if the cracks weren't new damage? What if they had always been there, but no one else could see them? I left the building shortly afterward. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as before. Cars passed normally. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalk. The city continued functioning without any awareness that something impossible stood quietly among its ordinary structures. But now I couldn't stop thinking about the cracks, because they didn't look random. They looked like the beginning of something, the kind of fractures that appear before a structure gives way, the kind engineers warn about in reports written after a disaster has already happened. And the more I thought about them, the more unsettling another possibility became. Maybe the building hadn't fully escaped the collapse. Maybe part of that event still existed, hidden inside the walls. The cracks that should not be growing. After the first visit, I told myself I wouldn't go back. The building had already violated too many assumptions about how the world works. It had collapsed once, at least in the version of reality I remembered, and yet it now stood intact, functioning like nothing had ever happened. That alone should have been enough. But the cracks stayed in my mind. Not just the fact that they existed, but the way they looked. They weren't the kind of surface damage you see in older buildings. They weren't random fractures caused by paint drying or temperature changes. They looked deliberate, like pressure marks. The kind structures develop when they have already experienced forces they were never designed to survive. For 2 days, I tried to ignore it. Then I went back. It was early evening when I entered the building again. The lobby was quieter than before. Only a single desk lamp illuminated the receptionist area, casting a weak yellow circle of light across the empty counter. Everything else looked unchanged. The elevators still worked. The directory still listed the same offices. Nothing suggested the building was in danger. But as soon as the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, I knew something was different. The crack I had seen during my first visit was longer. Not dramatically longer, but enough that the difference was unmistakable. Before it had stretched across perhaps 2 meters of wall. Now it ran almost the entire length of the corridor. For a moment I simply stood there, staring. Hairline fractures do not expand overnight. Structural movement in buildings happens slowly, over months, sometimes years. Concrete settles, foundations shift gradually. Engineers monitor these changes carefully because sudden expansion usually indicates serious failure. But what I was looking at had changed in less than 48 hours. I walked closer. The crack branched near the center now, splitting into 2 thinner lines that crawled toward the ceiling like the roots of something growing through the plaster. I felt an uneasy sensation settle in my chest. Because the crack didn't just look longer, it looked fresh. Tiny grains of plaster had fallen onto the carpet below. The edges were slightly jagged, as if the wall had recently separated along the fracture. Something inside the building was still moving. I continued down the hallway, and that was when I noticed the others. A second crack had appeared near the stairwell door. I was certain it hadn't been there before. It began near the floor and stretched diagonally upward, cutting across the wall like a thin blade mark. I walked the entire corridor slowly, scanning each surface. By the time I reached the end, I had counted 7 separate fractures. 7. I tried to convince myself I had simply missed them during the first visit, but that explanation didn't hold. Some of the cracks ran directly through areas I had examined carefully before. They hadn't been there. Something inside the structure was changing. I returned to the building again 2 nights later. This time, the difference was impossible to ignore. The main fracture along the hallway had spread another meter. The crack near the stairwell had reached the ceiling, and a new one had appeared across the floor tiles near the elevator entrance. That was when I started taking photographs, not because I expected anyone else to believe me, but because I needed proof for myself. Memory can be unreliable, perception can distort small details, but photographs preserve moments exactly as they are. I took pictures of every crack I could find. Then I left. The next morning, I compared the photos. That was when the pattern began to emerge. The cracks were not expanding randomly. They were spreading outward from specific points in the structure. The stairwell corner, the hallway center, the elevator frame. These were all areas that carry structural load inside most buildings, the exact places where engineers often detect early signs of collapse. And suddenly I remembered something from the disaster footage years ago. During the news coverage of the collapse, one engineer had explained that the building's load-bearing system had failed internally before the visible collapse began. The structure had been weakening from the inside, small fractures appearing in support points, invisible warning signs that went unnoticed until it was too late. What I was seeing now looked disturbingly similar, except the building had already collapsed once, which meant these fractures shouldn't exist anymore, unless the structure somehow still remembered that failure. That thought followed me for the rest of the day. A building remembering its collapse sounded impossible, but the alternative was worse, because if the fractures were growing, then the building might still be collapsing, just slowly, as if the disaster had never truly stopped. 3 nights later, something happened that made the situation even stranger. I told someone about the building, not the entire story, just a small part of it. A coworker had asked why I seemed distracted lately, and without thinking, I mentioned the cracks. I described how I had seen fractures spreading through the walls of a building that had supposedly collapsed years ago. He laughed, assuming it was just an old structure deteriorating. The conversation ended there. I didn't think much about it afterward, until the next time I returned. The difference was immediate. The crack near the stairwell had doubled in length, not gradually, not subtly, doubled. The fracture that once ended near the ceiling had now spread across it, forming a jagged line that stretched into the hallway beyond. 2 new cracks had appeared along the floor tiles. Another one split the corner near the elevator. I stood in the corridor, staring at the walls in disbelief. The building looked the same from the outside, but inside, something was accelerating. And then a thought occurred to me that made the entire situation feel colder. The cracks had grown the night after I told someone about the building. It could still be coincidence. Structures sometimes shift unexpectedly. Temperature changes can cause expansion. Small earthquakes can produce hairline fractures. There were many explanations, but the timing was too precise, so I tested it. 2 days later, I told another person, this time deliberately. I described the story in detail, how the building had collapsed years ago in the timeline I remembered, and how it now stood intact with fractures spreading through the walls. My friend listened politely, but clearly didn't believe a word of it. That night, I returned to the building again, and when I stepped into the hallway, the experiment confirmed my worst suspicion. The cracks had spread again, faster than before. A long fracture now ran across the entire ceiling. Another split the wall beside the elevator doors. The structure looked like glass beginning to shatter from invisible pressure. I felt a chill run through me as I walked slowly down the corridor, because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time I told someone the truth, the cracks grew, as if the building itself were reacting to the story, as if reality didn't want that information spreading. And the more people who heard it, the weaker the structure became. Standing there in the dim hallway, surrounded by fractures slowly crawling across the walls, I realized something terrifying. The building wasn't just damaged, it was unstable, balanced between 2 versions of reality, one where it had collapsed and one where it hadn't. And every time someone learned the truth, the structure moved a little closer to the version where it falls. The moment I tested the truth, once the idea entered my mind, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Every time I told someone about the building, the cracks seemed to grow. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining the connection, Human minds are good at finding patterns even when none exist. When something strange happens, we instinctively search for meaning, cause and effect, action and consequence. But the changes inside the building were too obvious. The fractures were spreading faster than any normal structural movement could explain, and the timing kept aligning with the same event. Someone hearing the story, someone learning the truth. If the connection was real, then there was only one way to confirm it. I had to test it, not accidentally, not casually, deliberately. For the next few days, I avoided talking about the building entirely. I didn't mention it to coworkers. I didn't bring it up in conversations. I didn't even search for it online again. Instead, I returned to the building each evening and observed. The cracks remained, but they didn't grow, not noticeably. The long fracture across the third-floor hallway stayed exactly the same length. The one near the stairwell corner hadn't expanded. The thin split along the ceiling above the elevator remained frozen in place. 3 days passed like that, then 4. The building wasn't healing, but it wasn't getting worse either. The damage had paused. That alone was unsettling, because buildings don't pause structural deterioration. If a fracture is under active pressure, it continues expanding. Gravity doesn't stop working for a few days and then resume later. But the cracks had stopped exactly when I stopped talking about the building. That was when I decided to run the test. I chose someone who lived outside the neighborhood, someone who had never seen the building before, a friend I trusted enough to listen without immediately dismissing the story. We met at a small cafe across town. For most of the evening, we talked about ordinary things, work, news, small frustrations that fill conversations when people are catching up. Then, eventually, the conversation slowed, and I told him, not vaguely, not as a strange rumor. I explained everything. The collapse 6 years ago, the archived news footage, the fact that the building still existed now as if the disaster had never happened. I described the cracks spreading through the walls, the fractures across the ceilings, the strange pattern I had started to notice. He listened quietly. At first, he smiled the way people do when they assume you're building toward a joke. But as the story continued, his expression shifted, not to belief, just curiosity. So you think the building remembers collapsing? He asked. I don't know what I think, I said, but something inside it is changing. And you think telling people about it causes the cracks? I think it might. He leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. Then he laughed softly. That's a pretty elaborate theory. I know, but tomorrow I'll know if it's wrong. That night I barely slept, not because I expected the building to collapse immediately, but because the possibility felt too large to ignore. If the theory was wrong, then the cracks were just an unexplained structural failure. Strange but ordinary. But if the theory was right, then something far more disturbing was happening, because it would mean reality itself was unstable, that 2 different outcomes, the collapse and the survival of the building, were somehow existing at the same time. And the act of remembering the collapse was pulling the world back toward that original outcome. The next evening, I returned to the building. The sky was already dark when I arrived. From the outside, nothing had changed. Cars passed normally. Lights glowed in several office windows. The building looked exactly as it had every other night. But my attention wasn't on the exterior anymore. It was on what waited inside. I stepped through the glass entrance doors. The lobby was empty. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above the tiled floor. For a moment I stood there, almost afraid to move. Because if the cracks had grown again, then the theory was real. And that meant the building wasn't just reacting to time or pressure. It was reacting to information. Finally, I walked toward the elevator. The metal doors reflected the pale overhead lights as they slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The elevator moved upward slowly, the same mechanical vibration I had felt on every previous visit. 2nd floor, then 3rd. The doors opened, and immediately I saw it. The crack across the hallway ceiling had spread. Not slightly, not subtly. It now stretched across the entire corridor, branching into several smaller fractures that ran along the ceiling corners like veins. I stepped out of the elevator slowly. The air in the hallway felt heavier somehow, though that was probably just my imagination. I walked toward the stairwell. The vertical fracture along the concrete corner had widened enough that the rough edges were clearly visible now. Tiny fragments of plaster had fallen onto the floor. Several new cracks had appeared along the wall beside it. I stopped halfway down the hallway, staring at the spreading lines. The change was undeniable. In less than 24 hours, the damage had accelerated again, exactly like before, exactly after someone else heard the story. The experiment had worked, but the result wasn't comforting. It was terrifying, because it meant the building wasn't just unstable, it was responding, as if every time the truth was spoken, something inside the structure shifted slightly toward the reality where it had already collapsed. I slowly turned in place, scanning the hallway. Cracks were everywhere now, across the ceiling, along the walls. Even the floor tiles near the elevator showed thin fractures running between them. The building looked less like a structure and more like a piece of glass under pressure, balanced at the edge of shattering. And standing there in that dim corridor, surrounded by spreading fractures, I realized something that made the entire situation worse. The experiment hadn't just confirmed the pattern, it had proven something else, something I hadn't considered before. The building didn't care who heard the story, it only cared that someone did, which meant every time the truth spread, the damage would grow. Every conversation, every explanation, every person who learned what really happened 6 years ago. Another crack, another fracture, another step closer to the moment when reality finally decides which version of the building is supposed to exist. The one that's standing, or the one that already fell. Reality is trying to correct itself. After the experiment, I stopped telling people, not gradually, immediately. The result had been too clear to ignore. Every time the story spread, the cracks inside the building grew. The fractures moved faster, deeper, as if something inside the structure was responding to the information itself. And if that connection was real, then continuing to talk about it would only make things worse. So I stopped. No more explanations, no more theories, no more late-night conversations about collapsing timelines or impossible buildings. For a while, it seemed to work. I still visited the building occasionally, but only to observe. The cracks remained exactly where they were. The long fracture across the hallway ceiling, the widening split in the stairwell corner, the thin network of hairline lines branching across the walls like frozen lightning trapped beneath the paint. But they didn't grow. Days passed. Then a full week. Nothing changed. The structure had stabilized, and for the first time since I rediscovered the building, I felt something close to relief. Maybe the damage had reached its limit. Maybe the building had absorbed whatever stress existed between the two realities. Maybe the collapse I remembered had already been corrected as much as the world required. But that sense of relief didn't last long, because the truth had already escaped once. And information, once spoken, has a strange way of spreading. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday evening. I returned to the building after several quiet days of avoiding the subject entirely. The lobby looked the same as always. The elevator still worked. The third-floor hallway still smelled faintly of old carpet and dust. But as soon as I stepped out of the elevator, I knew something had changed. A new crack had appeared across the wall beside the directory board. Thin, fresh, its edges slightly rough where the paint had separated. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. I hadn't told anyone new about the building, not recently. So why had the fracture returned? Then I remembered something I hadn't considered before. The person I had told during the experiment, my friend at the cafe. Just because I stopped talking about the building didn't mean he had. Curiosity spreads easily, especially when someone hears a strange story. Maybe he mentioned it to someone else. Maybe he described it the same way I had. Maybe the story had already moved further than I realized. And if that was true, then the cracks would continue to grow. Not because I was speaking, but because the truth itself was traveling. Over the next few days, the damage became impossible to ignore again. The fracture across the ceiling widened slightly. The stairwell cracks spread farther along the concrete corner. New lines began appearing near the floor where the hallway met the elevator entrance. The building had resumed its slow deterioration, but this time the pace felt different, more unpredictable. Sometimes a crack would grow overnight. Other times, several days would pass without visible change. It felt less like a steady collapse and more like something reacting in bursts, as if the structure were responding to moments when the story resurfaced somewhere. Another conversation, another listener, another mind learning about the collapse that wasn't supposed to exist. That was when the realization finally settled in. The building wasn't just damaged, it was caught between two versions of reality, one where the collapse happened and one where it didn't. In the version most people experienced, the disaster had never occurred. The building had stood quietly for decades, aging slowly like every other structure in the city. But in the version I remembered, the collapse had already taken place. Concrete crushed, steel twisted, a skyline suddenly missing a familiar shape. And somehow both outcomes still existed. Not fully, not visibly, but enough to leave fractures where the two realities overlapped. The cracks were not simply structural damage, they were pressure points, places where the world struggled to decide which version of events was true. And every time someone heard the story of the collapse, the balance shifted slightly. Memory has power, not in the mystical sense people often imagine, but in a simpler way. Memories define what we believe reality to be. If enough people remember an event, it becomes part of the accepted history of the world. And if enough people forget it, that event slowly disappears. The collapse I remembered had been forgotten, erased from records, removed from public memory, which meant the surviving version of reality, the one where the building never fell, had become dominant. But the moment someone heard the story again, that erased event returned. Even if they didn't believe it, even if they laughed it off, the information still existed, and reality had to account for it. Two conflicting histories occupying the same space. The building standing, the building collapsed. The cracks were where those histories collided. Standing in the third-floor hallway one evening, staring at the spreading fractures along the ceiling, I finally understood something that made the entire situation feel heavier. This wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about balance. Reality had already chosen a version where the collapse never happened. That version had stabilized the world. But every time the forgotten disaster resurfaced, every time someone learned about the collapse that wasn't supposed to exist, it weakened that stability, like pressure building beneath glass. Eventually, something would have to give. Either the story would disappear again, forgotten completely, or the building would correct the timeline itself and collapse, exactly the way it did 6 years ago. The cracks running through the walls weren't just signs of damage, they were warnings. Reality was trying to repair itself, and the more people who remembered the collapse, the more likely it was that the correction would finally happen. The more you know, the closer it gets to falling. I don't talk about the building anymore. Not in person, not online, not even as a joke. The last time I checked, the cracks had already spread across most of the third floor. The ceiling fractures connected like thin lightning strikes running from one end of the corridor to the other. The stairwell split had widened enough that pieces of concrete had started crumbling along its edges. The structure still stands, but it doesn't feel stable anymore. It feels like something waiting for the final push. For a long time, I thought the solution was simple. Stop telling the story. If the cracks only grew when people learned the truth, then silence would protect the building. As long as the collapse stayed forgotten, the version of reality where the structure survived would remain intact. At least, that's what I believed at first. But silence doesn't erase what already exists. The people I told still remember. Maybe they mentioned it to someone else. Maybe someone searched for the old footage. Maybe someone found the archived news reports that still exist deep inside forgotten servers. Information doesn't disappear once it spreads. It multiplies, quietly, unpredictably. And every time someone learns about the collapse, the building gets a little closer to remembering it too. I haven't returned to the third floor in several weeks. Not because I'm afraid of the cracks, but because I'm afraid of what I might see. If the fractures have continued growing, then the building is still moving toward the same ending it had once before, a collapse that reality tried to erase, but can't fully contain. Sometimes I wonder how many people already know, how many conversations have happened without me realizing it, how many minds now carry the same story. Because if enough people remember, if the forgotten timeline spreads far enough, then the balance will shift completely, and the world will correct itself. The building will collapse, exactly the way it was always supposed to. Which is why I shouldn't be telling you this. Every person who hears this story becomes part of the problem. Every person who learns what really happened 6 years ago adds a little more pressure to the structure. Another memory, another crack, another step closer to the moment when the building finally decides which version of reality it belongs to. So if you ever find yourself walking through the city and you see a 6-story concrete building with narrow vertical windows and a crooked metal sign above the entrance, don't go inside. And whatever you do, don't tell anyone about the cracks.
Shadows